You had to know if we're showing Legos that it's going to be me that's talking today, right? We just go together like that. My name is Paul McGinnis. Welcome. So glad to wrap up this series with you. Welcome to those of you watching online. We're glad that you can join us as well. And as I said, we wrap up this series today, this series on the Sermon on the Mount. 3 chapters of unbelievable teaching, timeless wisdom, profound insight from the lips of Jesus. We called the series Jesus On, and we've been going through it for 3 months now. Since the beginning of June, 12 weeks. This is week 12. And I got a quick question. How many of you have been able to be here, either here in the room or online, for all 12 of these weeks? Raise your hand high, because that is something to be proud of. Okay? And if you hold your hands up high enough, we'll try to get you the I Survived the Jesus On t-shirt, so you can take that home and commemorate this. Well done with that. We wrap up this series today, and let me just make a quick plug, because next week we start a brand new series that you're not going to want to miss. It's called This Is Us, and it's all about who we are as a church. What is at our DNA? Who are we at the core? Because if you were to ask people what they think of when they hear the word church, they might say a building. They might talk about a boring liturgy or ritual. They might talk about a show or a spectator sport where you just kind of watch and observe. But what is the church really, and what are we supposed to be? And as we explore not only the roots of our faith, but also our vision as a church, I think you're going to be inspired. I think you're going to be a little surprised in what the church really is and who we are and who we can be. So please, make it a point to be here. We'll give you invite cards as you leave today. You can keep that for yourself to remind you. You can pass that on to a friend. But here's my challenge. This is a much shorter series, only 4 weeks. And my challenge to you is to go 4 for 4. You think you can do that? You think you can be here all 4 of the next weeks? I think you can, and I look forward to seeing you for all 4 of the weeks in that series. But now back to today. Back to this conclusion of Jesus' sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. Here's where we get the final paragraph, where Jesus ties it all together, and he punctuates it with an exclamation point that moves us to action, that drives us forward, that nudges us. And that's his conclusion. And while we're talking about conclusions, quick question. What is the difference between the conclusion of Jesus' sermon and the conclusion of my sermon? Jesus' conclusion comes way too soon. Mine cannot come soon enough. Okay? You're laughing now, but give me about 90 minutes. We'll see who's laughing then. Jesus finishes, and everyone wished he would continue. I continue, and everyone wished I would just finish. But I can't help it, right? I've been a pastor since I graduated. I'm the son of a lifelong pastor. And I learned early on a little phrase that pastors use. And I'm going to give you a little secret. They don't teach you this unless you go to seminary. So when you hear a pastor say, in conclusion, just look at your watch, start a timer, because I'll tell you exactly what a pastor means when he says that. Absolutely nothing. It has no bearing at all as to how close we are to the end. I just got to warn you, okay? So in conclusion, or actually to get us started, to set up what Jesus wants to talk about, I want to share you some pictures and some stories from our recent trip to Haiti. Right, I was on that team that was in Haiti just a month ago. And we could tell so many stories. You could talk to the people that have gone. You could learn some of the experiences that we had. And the ones I want to share have to do with heartbreak and hope, because we experienced both. Right, in fact, our very last day in Haiti, our very last thing that we did before heading to the airport, actually on our way to the airport, before getting there, we stopped at the earthquake memorial. And you may remember the 2010 earthquake that rocked Haiti. And I say you may remember it. Everyone in Haiti remembers it. This is one of those moments that everyone has a story about. If they were there, they can tell you what they were wearing, where they were when they heard the news, when they felt the quake. They could tell you about the lives that were lost that day. And this memorial is built on what ended up becoming the mass grave where so many of those bodies were buried. And here, even a decade after, we're still feeling the aftershocks of that sobering moment. And that was just the beginning of so many challenges for Haiti. Just one of many. It was not just 3 years ago, 2016, that they were rocked with Hurricane Matthew that devastated the southern coast of Haiti. As we've gotten involved in Haiti, we learned about the child slavery that's happening there called Restavik, enslaving 300,000 children. And so there are so many of these images of unrest and of heartbreak, of brokenness. And yet that's not the only pictures of Haiti. Those aren't the only pictures. Those pictures actually give way to hope. Right? In the wake of that earthquake, millions of people got involved including people from Parker Hill, were on the ground helping with the relief efforts. It was at the 2-year anniversary of that earthquake that I had my first visit to Haiti, and we formalized a partnership where we're working with the leaders in those communities. It was just weeks after that earthquake in 2016 where a team of Parker Hill construction members and others went and helped to rebuild homes and lives. And that's where this picture was taken. And it captures some of the beauty, some of the hope, some of the optimism that's there as well. Because every team that goes will tell you that yes, there's brokenness, but there's also beauty. The leaders, the pastors, the teachers, the parents, they have an optimism and a confidence. We've seen churches that are vibrant, schools that are expanding, kids that are filled with this unexplainable joy. And everyone that goes will tell you that that's part of the picture of Haiti as well. And so there's these contrasts, right? There's these two pictures. And every time we go, we're faced with both of them. And I have a feeling that that is not unique to Haiti. That's not just something that's over there, right? That is something that's here as well. In fact, not just here, but here, right? If you look within even your own heart, even your own life, the lives of your loved ones, there's beauty and brokenness. There's heartache and there's also hope. I don't need to tell you this, you know. There's plenty of brokenness around us. You don't have to look far or read many headlines. Lives that are falling apart, marriages that are drifting and dying, relationships that are crumbling, hearts that have been broken, dreams that have been shattered. I could go on, but there's really no need. We all understand that. That's the life that we live in. But if you keep looking, and if you know what you're looking for, if your eyes are open, if your heart is open, you'll see hope as well. You'll see beauty as well. You'll see unshakable faith even in the midst of the hurricanes and the earthquakes. You'll see an unexplainable hope in spite of the sorrow that's all around us. You'll see an indescribable joy no matter what the circumstances. You know, you've seen it. You've had these moments, these beautiful memories. And so my question is, how do we move from this into this? How do we ensure that we don't live our lives here, but that we can experience this as well? How do we do that? How do we engage with this broken world, but also find the beauty? Is it just luck? Is it just only the strong survive, right? Whoever has the most strength and grit, whoever happens to just make it out unscathed? Is it just a cosmic accident, right? Nobody really knows. Is there anything that we can actually do to move us from the brokenness and toward the beauty? Isn't that the question? What if I were to tell you that that's the very question Jesus has been answering in this sermon for the last 3 chapters and the last 3 months? What if I were to tell you that the entire point of the Sermon on the Mount, the entire point of Jesus' whole life and ministry was to move us from the brokenness and toward the beauty? Imagine that. Imagine someone who said, in this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I've overcome the world. I can bring you through this. I came from the beauty and the hope, and I came to this brokenness, and I want to bring you out. What if that's what Jesus was offering in this sermon? So let's take a look at Jesus begins to wrap up. There's several stories that he tells, and I'm not going to spend much time in those stories, but he's going to set up this same contrast. He's going to show the beauty and the brokenness, and I want you to see that contrast, and I want you to understand the context for the very final paragraph. So Matthew chapter 7, verse 13, probably under his breath, Jesus said, in conclusion, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. You see the distinction? There's 2 paths. It's very clear, right? There's a wide gate and a narrow gate. There's a broad road and a small road. There's destruction and there's life. There's many and there's few. And Jesus continues with this saying back and forth in verse 15. Watch out for false prophets. They come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly they are ferocious wolves. By their fruit you will recognize them. Do people pick grapes from thorn bushes or figs from thistles? Likewise, every good tree bears good fruit, but a bad tree bears bad fruit. Good trees can't bear bad fruit, and bad trees can't bear good fruit. So there's 2 teachers, there's 2 trees, there's wolves and sheep, grapes and thorns, figs and thistles, good trees, good fruit, bad fruit. He keeps going back and forth, and he's not done. Verse 21, not everyone who says to me, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name? In your name did we not drive out demons? And in your name did we not perform miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. So we've had two paths and two trees and two teachers, and now there are two people. There are those who say certain things, and there are those who actually do things. There are those who know about Jesus and those who know Jesus. There are those that could be called fans, and there are those that are truly followers. And Jesus keeps going back and forth, and he's raising the stakes, and he's building his momentum, and he's building this crescendo. He's reaching his climax with these vivid pictures and these stark contrasts. And then he says this, therefore, to wrap up everything I've been saying, to put a bow on this, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house, yet it did not fall, because it had its foundation on the rock. But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. The rain came down, the streams rose, and the wind blew and beat against that house, and it fell with a great crash. That's it. That's what we've been looking for. That's the golden ticket. That's the silver bullet. That's exactly what we need to understand. In just 4 verses and this one unforgettable picture, Jesus tells us exactly how we can avoid the brokenness and move toward the beauty, how we can move through the heartache and toward hope. You see, he tells this story of these two builders, these two storms, these two guys who have two very different destinies. But before we get to their different destinies, before we get to what separates them, do you notice how much they have in common? Do you realize that they have so much similar with one another? Both of them heard Jesus' words. Verse 24, everyone who hears these words of mine, and then he goes on and talks about the one guy. And verse 26, everyone who hears these words of mine, and then he talks about the other guy. So they end up in different places, but they all heard the same thing. They all had the same information. They all knew the same stuff and had the same access. And then they both built houses, right? Verse 24, a wise man who built his house, and there's a foolish man who built his house. But they both did something with what they heard, right? They had the raw materials and they did something with it. They heard and they built, and get this, they both experienced storms. Verses 25 and 27 are word for word identical. The rain came down, the streams rose, the winds blew and beat against that house. So far, everyone's on the same playing field. Everyone is level, right? Everyone has heard the same thing. Everyone is doing something with what they've heard, and everyone is experiencing storms. There is no difference. It's true for everyone, and it's true for every one of us. What I've just said, it's true for you as well. You have heard. You have heard Jesus' words. Now, from looking at our survey earlier, you haven't heard it every single week over the last 12 weeks, but I'll forgive you for that. That's all right. We might get behind. We might miss a service now and then. That's not the point I'm making here. We might get behind in our reading, but we have access. We have access. We have heard the wisdom and the words of Jesus. We have accounts of the biographies of his life and his teaching. We have a church that can show us what Jesus has said in the way of Jesus and help us walk in that path. More than any other generation in history, we have access to God's word. We have access to the life, the teaching, the wisdom, the authenticity of Jesus. So we have heard. In fact, just in this series alone, look at what we've heard. We've heard Jesus, and these are the topics that just in the last 3 chapters, Matthew 5 through 7, we've heard what Jesus has to say about happiness and influence and anger, Jesus' directions for purity and revenge and authenticity, prayer, generosity, anxiety, judgment, love. We've heard, we understand, we know the wisdom, we have access to that. But that's not all. We are also building. Right? We may not be in the trades per se. We may not be able to swing a hammer, but we are building the lives that we are going to live in. We are doing something with what we've heard. We are doing something with the advice that Jesus has given, with the instruction that he's given. We are building these lives. We are making choices, And then those choices are making us. We are moving down a path one step at a time. We are laying bricks into the foundation of our life, whether we realize it or not. Because think about it, we decide who we're going to spend time with. We decide which interests we're going to pursue. We decide what we spend our time doing, what we put into our minds and our bodies. We decide which invitations we accept and which ones we refuse. We decide what we're going to say and text and tweet and snap. We decide how we're going to respond, again, to all of these things that Jesus has said. What are we going to do with our influence? How are we going to respond when we're angry? What kind of generosity are we going to show? What are we going to do about our anxiety? Are we going to go after revenge or are we going to go after love? We're making those decisions. We know and then we do. We've heard and now we're building. And then we are all going to face storms. We are all going to face storms. The storms don't decide. They play no favorites. The rain came on the wise builder and the foolish builder. The floods rise for the godly and the ungodly. The wind blows against the good and the bad. We all face storms, and you don't need me to tell you this. We all will experience heartache and disappointment and pain, loneliness and despair. Everyone feels hunger and thirst and disease. Infidelity affects us all, addiction, loss. We will all face storms. So in so many ways, these two builders are the same. In so many ways, all of us are the same. But then it changes. We do not all have the same destiny. We do not all end up with the same house at the end of the day. Verse 25 says, it did not fall, speaking of the wise man's house that was built on a rock. Verse 27 says, it fell with a great crash, speaking of the foolish man's house that was built on the sand. And so even though we started in the same place, we have so much in common, we are not all going to end up in the same place. And so what makes the difference? Why is it that some crash and some stand firm? Why is it that some seem to live in the brokenness and others can find their way to the beauty? Some seem to live in the heartache and others can find their way to hope. Why do some marriages last and others fall apart? Why do some people's character remain intact and other character just crumbles? Why do some relationships thrive and others just sour? Why is it that some legacies endure while others disappear as soon as the person's gone? What makes the difference? I'm sure that's what you want to know. That's what I want to know. That's the burning question. How do we avoid more of this and experience more of this? And Jesus is going to tell us. But first, I think it would be good if we talk about river bifurcation. Wouldn't you agree? That seems like a fitting thing to talk about now, because I know some of you came in and you were like, boy, river bifurcation has really baffled me, and I hope we can get a handle on that. So I'll just try to clear up the record. Bifurcation literally means fork. It's from a Latin word that means fork. And a river bifurcation is the scientific name of what happens when a creek, for some reason, splits. And you've seen this happen just with water in your driveway, or, there's something makes the water split. And in most cases, the water will split, and then it'll come back together again, and it'll just make a little island there. But in some cases, if the situation is just so, the water will split, and it will never return together again. It will form two separate streams permanently. The best example of this is in Wyoming, at this river. The river splits right there. And part of that river turns into what is now known as the Atlantic Creek. And it heads east, and it meets the Missouri River and the Mississippi River, and it drains into the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean. And part of that same creek heads west and doesn't stop till it reaches the Pacific Ocean. And that sign on the tree says the parting of the waters. Pacific Ocean this way, Atlantic Ocean this way. And from that very point, nothing is quite the same again. That point is fittingly called parting of the waters. The creek is called the Two Oceans Creek, and it turns into the Atlantic Creek and the Pacific Creek. It's a fascinating place in the woods of Wyoming. But this doesn't just happen in Wyoming. This happens in our lives all the time, doesn't it? People who have so much in common, and yet something happens, and they end up in very different places. Think about your siblings. You grew up in the same home, perhaps with the same parents, and yet you're in very different places now. Think about that childhood friend or that kid you played on the soccer team with. You guys were on the same team as kids, and yet you've taken very different paths since then. How about you and your roommate? You had so much in common in college, and yet now you're on very different roads. How about you and that colleague? You started at the company at the same time, but you're not in the same position now. How about two people who are diagnosed with the same illness? They respond to that very differently. They react to what's happening in different ways. How about those of us who have lost a loved one? We don't all respond to that situation the same. We experience the same thing, but then there's a parting of the waters, isn't there? What is that? What is it that shifts it? We all experience the same opportunities. We all make choices. We all face storms. And then some people are still standing after the storm, and others have crumbled because of the storm. What is it that makes the difference? Where is the parting of the waters in our hearts and in our lives? Jesus is very clear. Verse 24, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice goes on to become a wise man who's building his house on a rock, a house that will stand. Verse 26, therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice ends up as a foolish man, building his house on the sand, a house that will not stand. That is the difference, my friends. That is the parting of the waters. That is what separates us. That's what sends us in one direction or the other. That's what determines our destiny. Our decisions determine our destiny. Our decisions determine our destiny. It's not luck. It's not cosmic accident. It's what we do with the opportunities that we've been given. It's the choices that we make that put us on the path. Our decisions determine our destiny. You might not like that, but you can't really argue with the logic, right? If you head down this path, this is where you're going to end up. If you head down this path, this is where you're going to end up. And those of us that have lived a few years and we can look back, it makes so much sense. If you do those kind of things with your money, this is what's going to happen. If you hang out with those kinds of people, this is where you're going to end up. It's very clear. If you want intimacy and fulfillment in your marriage, don't mess around before and during your marriage. If you want financial stability, don't spend more than you make and don't get into debt. If you want to be trusted and respected, then be honest and dependable. If you want to have a great relationship with your kids when they're old, love and lead them when they're young. If you want positive friendships that'll last throughout time, invest in positive people time after time. If you want a firm foundation later, build it now. That's what Jesus is saying. That it's our decisions that will determine our destiny. It's not our desires. It's not how much we know. It's not what we think. It's what we do that determines where we're going to end up. You can't wait for the storm and then decide what kind of house you're going to build. You have to build that house ahead of time. You have to lay that foundation now, little by little, step by step, brick by brick. You can't put that off and then all of a sudden bring it together. So to drive this idea home, I've got a gift for you. So ushers, you can come down, you can pass those out. Do not tell my son, because last night I went into his room, I raided his toy box, took all the Legos, and now you get them. So you're welcome, and here's why. I've heard, I should say, that childbearing and giving birth is very painful. That's what I've heard. My wife has delivered 4 beautiful children. I'm thankful for that. But there is no pain like stepping on a Lego in the middle of the night with bare feet. There is no pain like that. And there is no way to get around that, right? They don't give you epidurals for Legos, right? So you get the Legos. So we'll pass down the rows. Go ahead and take one, pass the tray along to the outside. Take one Lego. Don't spend too long figuring out which one is yours, but go ahead and take one, look at it, pass the rest along, and then I want you to grab that Lego, hold that in your hand, and I want you to imagine all the things you could build with that. Imagine what you could do with that one Lego. Imagine what that could be a part of. And just to help your imagination, I'll show you some pictures from Legoland. Several years ago, I was able to take my kids to Legoland down in Florida. They can build anything with Legos. This is a built-to-scale Ford Explorer there in Legoland. This is a life-size Brachiosaurus built out of Legos. There are entire cities built out of Legos. There's all the scenes from the Star Wars movies built out of Legos. You can wander around there for days playing with Legos, building with Legos. And here's my question. Take the one in your hand. What would it take? What is the process to take this pile of random Legos and turn it into a 20-foot Brachiosaurus? How do you do that? One brick at a time. You do it one brick at a time. You don't just do it all of a sudden. It's not just one decision. It's one step at a time. It's not one big move. It's lots of small decisions. And listen, friends, the same is true with the lives that we are building. You don't get to build a firm foundation all of a sudden. You don't build a solid life just out of the blue. You don't secure your destiny just once and for all. It's not one defining decision. It's not one crucial choice. It's not by putting it off now and then flipping a switch later. It's lots of steps in the same direction, lots of decisions down the right path, lots of bricks that build a firm foundation. And that is what I want for you. You are going to face storms, and I want you to be the ones who survive the storms. But you need to prepare for that now. Now is the time to start making the right choices, doing the right things, building the right foundation. That's what I want for you, and that's what I want this Lego to represent. I don't know what that decision is for you, but it could be this small. But it's one small step in the right direction. It's one deliberate decision that's going to point you toward the right destination. It's one little Lego that can be part of a firm foundation. What does that need to be for you? I may not know that answer, but you and God can figure that out. What's that one decision that you need to start being consistent about? I want you to make one move as we wrap up this series, as we wrap up this sermon. Make one move. But first, let me tell you about Gary Jansen. Gary Jansen always wanted to be a writer, but he didn't know where to start. So he just decided he would take 1% of every day and practice writing. Do you know how much 1% of 24 hours is? 14 hours and 24 seconds. So he just rounded up to 15 minutes. If you could take 15 minutes, and he just says, I'm just going to write for 15 minutes every day. And he would tell you that some of that stuff that he wrote early on, most of that nobody ever read because it wasn't any good. But do you know what happens when you write for 15 minutes every day for a year? You've spent 5,000 minutes writing, and you're starting to get a little bit better. You're moving in the right direction. You are building the right muscles. You are making what he calls micro shifts, just small decisions, small steps, deliberate moves in the same direction. And that's what turned into his book, Micro Shifts. And that's what led him down a path that now sees him as the senior editor of Penguin Random House Publishers. Not bad for a guy who started out spending 1% of each day writing. I don't want all of you to be writers or to become the publishers, but I do want you to become all that God wants you to be. And that begins today. And that begins with small micro shifts. That begins by making one move. Make one move. You have the access to Jesus' wisdom and teaching. You know certain things. You know what you should do. You know what Jesus says. And now your decision is to either move in his direction or continue in your own direction. Make one move. Imagine what you can do in 15 minutes. Imagine what you could do in that amount of time. You could take a walk. You could phone a friend. You could read or exercise or write or paint. You could read scripture or journal or pray. You could begin to put something into practice, not just thinking and dreaming, but doing something consistently over time. You could take any one of the topics that Jesus has talked to us about, and you can head down that path. How can I deal with my anger in more constructive ways? How can I make the most of the influence and opportunities God's given me? What can I put into my life that's going to allow me to experience the purity that God wants for me? How can I become more generous? What can I do to be less judgmental or less anxious? You could start to make micro shifts, one small decision the size of a single Lego piece, and that's going to add up. Let me put it to you this way. Don't look now, but 4 months from today, Merry Christmas! 4 months from today is Christmas. Yeah, that's crazy. But imagine what could happen 4 months from now if you stay consistent with one small choice, with making one move, with building one brick and another for 4 months. I guarantee you will see growth. You will see change. You will see that you are building a firm foundation. So start today. I can't promise that it's going to be easy. In fact, I can promise the opposite. If you start moving toward what God wants you to do, if you start moving in that direction with your finances, with your relationship, with your faith, with whatever it is, it's going to be hard. I can guarantee you that. But listen, crashing is even harder. Date night is difficult. That's hard to keep that on the calendar and be consistent with that. But you know what? Divorce is even harder. Accountability, that's hard. Being honest with people, sharing how you've messed up and where you need help. Accountability is hard, but addiction, that's a whole lot harder. Building a budget for your finances and staying within that, that's hard. Bankruptcy is a whole lot harder. So you just decide. Decide to do the little hard things now instead of experiencing the brokenness later. And let me just say that it is never too soon to start, and it is never too late to start again. It is never too soon to start. Some of you have youth on your side. You're students, you're teenagers, you're in school, or you're in your 20-somethings, and there is no one here older that wouldn't give that youth, that wouldn't want to go back and do a few things differently. I certainly don't want to relive much of those years, but I would do a few things differently. It is not too soon to start. And those of you that are young, please listen. Build some positive habits now. Avoid addictions. Stay away from stuff that's going to mess you up later. Be smart with your money. Be careful with your heart and other people's hearts. It is not too soon to start building a foundation. Start acting now like the person you'd like to become. Those of you that have lived some life, that have some years behind you like I do, it is never too late to start again. It is never too late to start rebuilding. Yeah, we've messed up. We've crashed a few times. We've got the scars to prove it, but don't stay down. Get back up and rebuild, because that's the God we serve. A God who can bring beauty out of whatever brokenness you have in your life. A God who stands with arms wide open. You're not too far gone. You're not too far down. You're not too far away. We can clean that up. We can redeem that. We can build again. And your next season could be your best yet. The best is yet to come. It is never too early to start and never too late to start again. So take that brick. Make one move. Decide what it is that Jesus is saying to you that you're going to start to invest in, you're going to start to move toward. In conclusion, I do want to shift our attention to why Jesus. You see, what I've said so far could be true of any leader, of any spiritual leader. You could pattern your life around anyone, right? You could see what they say, you could do what they do, and you'll end up similar to where they want you to be. Right? You could follow anyone. You could go down any path. But why should we follow Jesus? Why should we pay attention to his life and his teaching and his wisdom? Well, the answer is really no different than what it was years ago. Right? Years ago, when Jesus preached this sermon, here's how they responded in verse 28. When Jesus had finished saying these things, the crowds were amazed at his teaching, because he taught as one who had authority and not as their teachers of the law. You see, 2,000 years ago, there was no one like Jesus. There was no one who spoke with that authority and lived with that kind of grace. There was no one who had that depth of love and also that understanding and wisdom and truth. There was no one like him, no one who spoke so convincingly and lived so compellingly. And friends, I need to tell you that has not changed in 2,000 years. That it's true, you can follow whoever you want, a brilliant professor or an A-list celebrity. You can follow another religious leader, but none of them stands where Jesus stands. He has set himself apart, unique in all of history. There is no one like him, because no one else taught and then gave his life and then came back from the dead. No one else has left an empty tomb behind. No one else has the evidence that points to nothing else than him being the Son of God. That is why we should follow him. And that's not just me saying that because I have a Jesus bias. Historians and anthropologists have studied the impact that Jesus of Nazareth has had on our culture, and it is unprecedented. Listen to what Harvard professor Harvey Cox says. The words of the Sermon on the Mount are the most luminous, most quoted, most analyzed, most contested, most influential moral and religious discourse in all of human history. That may sound like an overstatement, but it is not. Yale historian Yaroslav Pelikan wrote this: regardless of what anyone may personally think or believe about him, Jesus of Nazareth has been the dominant figure in the history of Western civilization for almost 20 centuries. He stands alone. He deserves our worship. He deserves our lives. He is worthy of following more than anyone else in history because he is the Son of God, came to bring us out of the brokenness and toward the beauty. Our band is going to come and lead us in a song that ties this theme together so perfectly because it looks at why Jesus is worthy. Why should we build our lives on him? Because he stands apart. You've heard the phrase King of Kings and Lord of Lords. We use it in lyrics sometimes. It was in one of the songs we sang earlier, refer to Jesus as the King of Kings. We talk about him having a name above every other name. Think about the truth behind that. If we were to gather together all of the kings that have ever lived, all of the leaders that have ever ruled, every leader and lord and king, anyone with authority and power, if we were to gather them all throughout history and throughout time from all across the globe, gather them into one room, Jesus would stand above them all as the king of all those kings, the Lord over all of those lords. He is the only one worthy of our lives. He is the only one worth building our lives upon. He is the one worth following. You will never regret that decision. But it happens one brick at a time, one move at a time, one step at a time. Jesus, we come to you now, and we give you our lives because you've given yours for us. You are the one that's worthy of following. No one else. No one else can offer what you offer. No one else gives the life that you give, the hope that you give. No one else can bring us through the storms of life and give us hope. No one else can help us find beauty in the brokenness that we've made of this world. And so, Jesus, as hard as it is, and as much as we're tempted to do otherwise, we give our lives back to you, one step at a time, one move at a time, one brick at a time. We've messed up plenty of times in the past, and we embrace the forgiveness and the hope that you offer. And today we start fresh, young and old. We start moving in the right direction and building a life that will last on the foundation that is you. In your name we pray. Amen.